I came to Romania at 61 for a woman. I sold my truck, packed 2 suitcases, and left a whole life behind because I thought she was my future. I thought I was building a new life with her. Turns out I was just building. And in the end, that was a hell of a lot better. This chair here, this is solid oak. You can't cheat with wood like this. It tells you exactly what it is. If there's a flaw, it's right there for you to see. It doesn't pretend. For 40 years, I worked with my hands, operating heavy machinery, building roads, laying foundations. I know what it takes for something to last. You need a solid base. You need honest materials. When I met Elena online, I thought we had that. She was smart, beautiful, and for the first time in years, someone saw me. Not just a retired guy with a pension, but a man with stories to tell. The plan we made, it looked perfect on paper. The numbers worked. The logic was sound. Move to Bucharest, live a life I could never afford back in Indiana, and do it with a woman who adored me. It was a foundation I thought I could build a whole second life on. But a foundation built on the wrong ground with the wrong materials, well, it doesn't matter how well you build on top of it. It's going to crack. And mine didn't just crack. It fell apart completely. To understand how I got from a life I'd planned so carefully to this one, surrounded by sawdust and contentment instead of fancy restaurants and broken promises, I have to go back to the beginning. Back to a quiet house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where this whole unbelievable story actually started. Before Romania, before Elena, before any of this, there was just a house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a 3-bedroom place I'd sold after the divorce. For 5 years, I'd lived in a smaller rental, and the silence in that place was louder than any machine I ever operated. For 40 years, I worked for the same municipal construction company. 40 years. You don't do that by cutting corners. I ran bulldozers, backhoes, graders. I knew how to read the earth, how to lay a foundation that would outlive me. I was good at my job. I was proud of it. When I retired, I was financially secure. Not rich, not by a long shot, but careful. My 401k had about $450,000 in it, and my pension brought in another $2,200 a month. It was enough. It was supposed to be enough. My marriage of 30 years hadn't ended with a fight. It just ran out of road. We were good roommates who had nothing left to talk about. Our kids were grown, living their own lives in other states, and suddenly I was 61 years old, and my whole world had shrunk to the grocery store, the remote control, and the 4 walls of a house that didn't feel like mine. I felt like a ghost. I'd spent my entire life building things, tangible things you could see and touch. And now there was nothing to build. I was becoming obsolete, a piece of old machinery left to rust in a field. The loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical weight. It was the reason I stayed up too late, watching whatever was on. It was a Tuesday night, one of 1,000 identical Tuesday nights when it happened. I was scrolling through some travel blog on my laptop, not even really reading it. An article about affordable countries in Europe. I clicked on one about Romania, saw pictures of these old medieval towns in a place called Transylvania, and in the comments section, someone had written this witty, smart reply to another comment. A woman named Elena, from Bucharest. I don't know why I did it. I'd never done anything like it before. But I replied to her comment. That one click started 8 months of conversation. Every day we'd send messages. Soon we were doing video calls that lasted for hours. She was 48, an office administrator in the capital. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She listened. When I told her stories about my work, about pouring concrete in the dead of winter, or grading a road to a perfect 1% slope, she wasn't bored. She was fascinated. She made me feel interesting. She saw a man, not a retiree. For the first time in a decade, I felt like someone was actually seeing me. Deep down, there was this fear that I was too old, too set in my ways for a second chance. That maybe I was just a walking pension plan. But Elena made me believe otherwise. We talked about everything, including money. My pension alone, I calculated, would let us live a life in Bucharest that was 10 times better than the one I had in Indiana. It wasn't a blind leap of faith. It looked like a solid plan. It looked like a foundation. And I was ready to build again. The trigger wasn't a single event. It was more like a slow-moving landslide you don't notice until your whole world is shifting under your feet. For 8 months, Elena was my first message in the morning and my last video call at night. She was showing me her world, one pixel at a time. She'd walk through the streets of Bucharest with her phone, a river of people and noise behind her, and I'd be sitting in my quiet rental, the loudest sound being the hum of the refrigerator. She'd show me the parks, the markets, what she was cooking for dinner. It felt like I was already there. My life in Fort Wayne had gone from black and white to color, but the color was all on a 15-inch screen. One night, it hit me. It was a Friday. She was on a video call, laughing with some friends at a cafe. The place was buzzing. She held up her phone to show me. "Mike, you should be here. They would love you," she said. And I believed her. When the call ended, I was left looking at my own reflection on the dark screen. The silence in my house that night wasn't just quiet, it was empty. I was 61 years old and I was watching life happen through a window. I'd spent 40 years building things for other people. It was time to build something for myself. That was the night the what if turned into a how. I'm a practical man. I don't jump without checking the ground. So, I started making a list, just like I would for any job site. The first item was money. I opened a spreadsheet. My pension was $2,200 a month, guaranteed. I started researching the cost of living in Bucharest. A nice apartment, Elena had told me, was maybe $500 or $600 a month. A 3-course meal for $10, a beer for $2. I put the numbers in. Then I checked them again. The math wasn't just good, it was undeniable. My pension alone would give us a life I couldn't even dream of in the States. My 401k, all $450,000 of it, could just sit there, untouched. A safety net, a foundation. The next item on the list was trust. I'd heard the stories. Old American guy meets younger foreign woman. I wasn't a fool. We had long talks about it. "Mike," she said to me one night, her face serious on the screen, "I have a good life. I have a job. I have my apartment. I don't need a man to save me. I want a partner to share my life with." And she showed me. She gave me a virtual tour of her apartment, a small but tidy place. She introduced me to her sister over a video call. It all looked real. It looked honest. It was a different kind of blueprint than I was used to, but all the measurements seemed to add up. The final item was the biggest. Me. Could I actually do it? Leave everything I'd ever known? For a week I wrestled with it. That old fear came creeping back in, the one that tells you you're too old, that your best days are in the rearview mirror. What was I thinking, starting over at 61? I was an old piece of machinery, wasn't I? That's what I'd told myself for years. But Elena's voice was in my head. "You are the most interesting man I've ever met," she'd say. "You've built a country. You have stories." Maybe she was right. Maybe I wasn't obsolete. Maybe I just needed a new place to plug in. So I made the decision. I called my son, then my daughter. They were hesitant, but they heard the life in my voice for the first time in years. The next day, I put my truck up for sale. I looked up the process for a long-stay visa in Romania. Proof of funds, a clean record, health insurance, it was all just paperwork. It was a process, and I was good at following a process. The plan was solid. The foundation was set. I packed everything I thought I'd need into 2 suitcases, and everything I left behind. I was finally building again. And this time, I was building a life. The moment I stepped out of the Henry Coanda airport, the air hit me differently. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the smell, the sounds, the energy of a city that had been running for centuries before I was even a thought. Elena was there, just like she promised, and seeing her in person for the first time, it was like a black and white movie suddenly bursting into color. She was even more beautiful than on the screen. She laughed, threw her arms around me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That first month was a whirlwind, a honeymoon. It was everything the video calls had promised, but in high definition. We found a nice modern apartment to rent, and the cost was just like I'd calculated, around $600 a month. It felt like a steal. Back in Fort Wayne, that would get you a shoebox. Here, we had a balcony overlooking a street lined with trees. Elena was the perfect guide. She took me everywhere. We walked through the old town with its cobblestone streets and buildings that looked like they held 1,000 stories. She'd point out a landmark, tell me a piece of its history, and I'd just be standing there thinking, I live here now. The life I had only seen on a spreadsheet was suddenly real. We'd go out for dinner, and it felt like we were robbing the place. I remember one meal in particular, a little restaurant with checkered tablecloths. We had a 3-course meal, a rich sour soup called chorba, then a plate of sarmal, which are these incredible cabbage rolls, and dessert. The whole bill, with a bottle of wine, came out to something like $20. I handed the waiter a $20 bill and some change, and I just started laughing. In the States, that's 2 appetizers. Here, it was a feast. My pension, which felt so modest in Indiana, made me feel like a king in Bucharest. For the first few weeks, I felt like I hadn't just moved countries. I'd found a cheat code for life. I was living a life I had only ever dreamed of, and I was doing it with a woman who looked at me like I was the most fascinating man in the world. The foundation felt solid. It felt perfect. The first little hairline crack appeared so quietly, I almost didn't notice it. We were walking past a real estate office, and Elena stopped, pulling me to the window. The pictures showed these beautiful, brand new apartments. Look, Mike, she said, her voice full of excitement. Imagine us in a place like that. We could own it. It would be ours. I looked at the prices. $120,000. Now I had that. It was sitting in my 401k. But in my mind, that was the safety net. That was the never touch money. I'd built that fund for 40 years. It was the bedrock. You don't just casually dig into the bedrock. I smiled and said something non-committal like, yeah, they look great. I told myself she was just dreaming. That's what you do when you're in love. You dream about a future. I didn't see it as a plan. I saw it as a wish. But the wish started turning into a blueprint. A few days later, we were talking about her car, an older Dacia that had seen better days. For all the traveling we will do, for our future, we'll need something better, she said. Something safe. The we and our always sounded so good. But I started to notice that our plans always seemed to have a price tag attached, and the price tag was always aimed at my bank account. When I'd talk about the future, I'd talk about walks in the park, maybe learning a few words of Romanian, finding a rhythm. Her future was a bigger apartment, a nicer car, expensive weekend trips to Paris or Rome. It was like we were looking at the same job site, but I was thinking about building a solid, comfortable house, and she was drawing up plans for a palace. The real disconnect, the one that felt like a jolt, came when I talked about getting my hands dirty. I was getting restless. 40 years of building things doesn't just switch off. I saw a neighbor struggling with a loose hinge on his gate, and I thought, I could fix that in 10 minutes. I mentioned to Elena that maybe I could find a small space, a garage or something, to set up a little workshop. Just a hobby, a place to tinker, to feel useful. She looked at me with this strange expression, a mix of confusion and pity. Mike, you are retired, she said, touching my arm. You worked your whole life. You don't have to do that anymore. That is for old men with nothing better to do. We have a life to live. And that stung. That was the first time I felt like maybe she didn't see me at all. My skills, the very thing I had built my life and my pride on, were being dismissed as a pointless hobby for an old man. It wasn't about the money. It was about purpose. To her, my value was in the pension and the 401k. The rest of me, the part that knew how to fix things, how to build things that last, that was obsolete. An old machine to be left in the field. The exact feeling I'd moved halfway across the world to escape. The test came about a month later. Her brother had a problem. He had some can't-miss business opportunity, a deal that was going to make him rich, but he was short on capital. It was an emergency. He needed $5,000, and he needed it by the end of the week. She told me this over dinner, her eyes full of worry. She framed it as a family crisis, something that was causing her sister and her mother so much stress. She never asked me directly for the money, it was smarter than that. She presented a problem that I and my wallet were the obvious solution to. I hesitated. I couldn't help it. I'm a man who counts every screw on a job site. $5,000 isn't a small thing. It's an emergency fund. It's a roof repair. It's not something you just hand over for a vague business opportunity. I told her I needed to think about it, and for the first time, the warmth was gone from her eyes. It was like a switch had been flipped. The affection that had flowed so freely suddenly became conditional. "I thought you were my partner, Mike," she said, her voice quiet and cold. "I thought we were a team." All night there was a wall between us. The beautiful, vibrant life we were building suddenly felt transactional. It felt like a house built on sand, and I could feel the tide starting to come in. In the end, I gave her the money. All $5,000. I told myself it was a test. A stupid, expensive test, but a test nonetheless. If I did this, if I showed I was all in, maybe the warmth would come back. Maybe we could get back to that feeling of the first month. I transferred the money from my U.S. account. It felt like pulling a tooth. 40 years of saving, of being careful, and here I was, handing over a chunk of it for a business opportunity I couldn't even see the blueprints for. The moment the money was sent, the smile came back to her face. The affection returned. But it felt different. It felt paid for. She hugged me and said, "I knew I could count on you, Mike. We are a team." But I didn't feel like part of a team. I felt like the guy who bankrolls the team. The foundation I thought we were building together suddenly felt like it was all resting on my shoulders, and the ground was getting softer by the day. The weeks that followed were quiet. Too quiet. On the surface, things were back to normal. We went out to dinner, we walked in the park. But that coldness I felt from her that one night, it didn't really go away. It was just hiding behind a smile. I started to see our life as a series of transactions. My pension paid the rent. My savings were for the future. My presence was for what? I wasn't a partner. I was a provider. The exact thing I'd feared. I was a walking 401k with a heartbeat. My stories about my old job, the ones she used to love, now seemed to bore her. She'd nod, her eyes drifting to her phone. The man she was fascinated with for 8 months online was now just the guy sitting across the table from her. And the loneliness I felt, sitting in that beautiful Bucharest apartment next to this beautiful woman, was 100 times heavier than the loneliness I'd felt in my empty rental in Fort Wayne. At least there, the silence was honest. I had to get out. I needed some air. I'd read about Transylvania, seen the pictures of the old Saxon towns. I told Elena I wanted to take a weekend trip just to see more of the country. I asked her to come, but she waved it off. "Oh, Mike, those are just sleepy little towns for old people. The city is where the life is." And just like that, she'd drawn another line between us. So, I went alone. I booked a room in a small guest house in a town called Sibiu, packed an overnight bag, and got on a train. Watching the concrete blocks of Bucharest give way to rolling green hills felt like I could finally breathe again. The guest house in Sibiu was run by a man my age named Marius. He had a kind face, a thick mustache, and hands that had seen their share of work, just like mine. The place was charming, but the front gate was a mess. It was heavy, made of old iron and wood, and it was dragging on the stone path, making a horrible screeching sound every time you moved it. I saw Marius out there, kicking it in frustration. We got to talking, a mix of his broken English and my zero Romanian. He told me he'd called a local guy to fix it, who wanted the equivalent of a few $100s for the job. It was a ridiculous price. I took a look. It wasn't a big deal. The bottom hinge was bent, and the post had settled. It was a $5 problem, not a $500 one. "You have tools?" I asked him. He led me to a small shed in the back. It was full of old, well-used tools, the kind your grandfather passes down to you. I felt a peace settle over me that I hadn't felt in months. I grabbed a crowbar, a heavy hammer, a few blocks of wood, and a wrench. For the next 2 hours, I was completely lost. Not in a bad way, but in the best way possible. I wasn't thinking about Elena, or the money, or my shrinking 401k. I was thinking about leverage, and angles, and the satisfying thud of a hammer hitting its mark. I dug out a little bit of earth, reset the post, straightened the hinge with a few careful, powerful blows, and rehung the gate. It swung shut with a soft, satisfying click. Perfect. Marius came out and saw the gate. He pushed it open. He closed it. A huge smile spread across his face. He started talking a mile a minute in Romanian, clapping me on the back. He tried to press a fistful of money into my hand. I pushed it away. No, I said. "Is okay. My pleasure." That evening, he refused to let me pay for the room. He insisted I eat with his family. I sat at a long wooden table in their kitchen with his wife, his son, his daughter-in-law, and their 2 little kids. Nobody spoke much English. I didn't speak much Romanian. But it didn't matter. They passed me plates of homemade food, rich with flavor and history. Marius poured me a small glass of something clear and potent called suica that burned a clean path down my throat and warmed me from the inside out. I watched the family talk and laugh. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the feeling. It was connection. It was real. I hadn't bought a single thing. I hadn't paid for my dinner. I had traded my skill for his hospitality. And in that simple, honest exchange, I felt more welcome and more valued than I had in 6 months of living a life of paid-for luxury. I realized I had it all backward. I came to Romania thinking my value was in my bank account. But sitting at that table, I understood that my real worth, the part of me that could never be spent, was in my hands. When I got back to Bucharest, the city felt wrong. The air in the apartment was stale. Elena was on the couch, her face lit by the blue glow of her phone. She looked up when I came in, but her eyes were blank. "You're back," she said. It wasn't a question. I stood by the door with my overnight bag still in my hand. The warmth from Marius's kitchen, the smell of the wood in his shed, it was all a world away. I knew I couldn't stay, not for one more night. "Elena," I said, "I'm leaving." She put her phone down, a small, annoyed sigh. "Leaving? What are you talking about? Are you going back to Indiana?" "No," I said. My voice was steady, steadier than I felt. "I'm moving to Sibiu." I watched her face, waiting for the shock, for the hurt, for the tears, for a single sign that this thing between us was real. It never came. Her expression shifted. The polite annoyance was gone. Something else took its place. Something I'd seen before. It was the look of a manager calculating a loss. "The apartment," she said. "The lease is in both our names. It's for a full year." And there it was. Not, "What about us?" Not, "Why?" But, "What about the lease?" It was the cleanest, coldest, most honest thing she had said to me in 6 months. The whole dream collapsed in that one single moment. It wasn't a house built on a bad foundation. It was never a house at all. It was a stage set. And I was done playing my part. I'm a practical man. She was a practical woman. I would end this in the only language she seemed to understand. "I'll pay out my half of the lease," I told her, "and I'll give you something extra, for the trouble." I thought of the $5,000 for her brother, the price of admission. It seemed right to have a price for the exit, too. $5,000, I said. And then I saw it. A flicker of relief in her eyes. The tension in her shoulders disappeared. She wasn't losing a partner. She was getting a severance package. She nodded slowly. The deal was acceptable. "Okay, Mike," she said, her voice smooth and even. "If that is what you have decided." That was it. 8 months of video calls, a life packed into 2 suitcases, a $450,000 safety net I was willing to risk. It all ended with a quiet business transaction on a Tuesday night. I turned around. I didn't unpack my bag. I didn't have to. There was nothing for me in that apartment. I walked out the door and didn't look back. As it clicked shut behind me, I could already picture her, phone back in her hand, scrolling. Moving on. And for the first time in a very long time, so was I. And so, here I am. It's been a year and a half since I left Bucharest. I'm in Sibiu. I rent a small apartment with a garage that I've turned into this workshop. It cost me $300 a month. My pension, that same $2,200 that felt like a king's ransom in the city and barely enough in Indiana, is more than enough here. It covers my needs, and I spend my days in here surrounded by the smell of sawdust and varnish. I don't run a business. I don't have to. I fix things for my neighbors. A wobbly chair for the old woman down the street, a new shelf for the young family next door. Sometimes they pay me a little. More often, I come home to find a bag of fresh vegetables or a bottle of homemade wine on my doorstep. I have friends here. Marius still comes by every week, just to talk. We sit in here, drink coffee, and we don't need a lot of words to understand each other. I'm alone, but I haven't been lonely for a single day. I am home. Looking back on it all, it would be easy to get bitter, to say I was a fool. But I wasn't a fool. I was just a man who built his new life on a single pillar. And when that pillar cracked, the whole thing almost came down. I learned a couple of things from that. Lessons that are as solid as anything I ever built out of concrete. The first is this: your value is not your bank account. I walked into that relationship thinking my pension and my 401k were my best assets. And because that's what I projected, that's all she saw. I became a provider, not a partner. When your only contribution is financial, the relationship becomes a transaction, and you can't build a life on a transaction. It's a foundation made of sand. The second lesson came from that rusty old gate. The very skills I thought were obsolete, the ones Elena dismissed as a hobby for an old man, turned out to be my most valuable currency. Here, in this small town, my ability to work with my hands, to fix what is broken, that's what connected me to people. That's what earned me respect. That's what made me part of a community. I wasn't buying my way in. I was building my way in. The lesson here isn't, don't move for love. The lesson is, don't make love your only plan. A new life needs more than one pillar to stand on. It needs a foundation. So if you're thinking about making a big move, ask yourself, what are you bringing besides your wallet? What can you build? What can you fix? What can you contribute? Go find the place where that answer is valued. That's where you'll find your real home.